Good evening. My name is Holly, and I'm the programs coordinator at the Osgood Township Museum. In addition to our speaker tonight, we'll also be joined by our executive director James, who will kind of be overseeing any tech-related stuff. So the Osgood Township Museum acknowledges that our museum, located in Vernon, Ontario, just south of Ottawa, is on the traditional unceded ancestral land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Algonquin and Anishinaabe are the original inhabitants of this territory along the Ottawa, Rideau, and Castor rivers and have lived on this land since time immemorial. We are grateful to be gathering here tonight to share stories as generations before us also have. If you've never been to the museum before, the Osgood Township Museum tells the story of Ottawa's agricultural and rural heritage in the former Osgood Township. We're open all year, and we're excited to slowly start to wind down the year, but I'd be lying if I said we didn't have stuff on our plate, because we do. We still have a number of programs coming up. This weekend is our Gothic Tea and Talk, which fortunately, unfortunately, has sold out. But if there's any interest still circulating around that, please do send us an email. We will likely be doing this talk again around the fall season next year. We also have on November 22nd two events. We'll be at the Vernon Craft Sale at the Community Center, and we will also be celebrating the Osgood Library's 100th year anniversary. So you can catch us in two places next Saturday. And then finally, to wrap up November, we have our annual tree lighting program on the 30th. So more information will be posted to our website soon. And then towards the middle of November, or sorry, December-ish, end of December-ish, early January, the museum will be closed for our holidays. So do make sure to follow us on socials for updates regarding our closures and, of course, our 2026 programs. And if you would like to get your museum fixed before the end of the year, we actually do have one new exhibit in two different places about Remembrance Day and sort of our veterans. We're highlighting a couple of stories in our community gallery. So if you did want to come down to the museum and see something new, we do have that exhibit that went up last week. So finally, as we get into the presentation, I will be moderating the chat. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them in the chat and then I will relay them to Hazel during the Q&A part of the presentation. And I am very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Hazel Scott Pankratz. Hazel is a PhD candidate in history at Western University, where her research focuses on the intersections of technology, the body, and lived experience in the Canadian artillery during the First World War. She lives with her partner in London, Ontario, and we have also been professional colleagues for quite some time. So I'm very excited to have her here to tell us a little bit more about how maybe our region kind of fits into a greater history of the First World War. So I will now pass the virtual mic to Hazel to tell us more.
So thank you again, Holly, for that introduction, and good evening to everyone here. It's lovely to see you all virtually from broadcasting from London, Ontario. Now, I'd like to begin tonight's presentation by asking you to do something just quickly. I'd like all of you just to, in your own minds, picture a battlefield from the First World War. Doesn't matter what battle, doesn't matter what year, just anyone. What do you see? What does it look like? For many of you, I expect the answer would probably look something like this here on the left. And if this is what you pictured, you are by no means wrong. The First World War was notorious for its usage of trench warfare. It was one of its distinguishing features, at least on the Western Front. As we know, it was a world war, so the theaters of war expanded well beyond the sort of region of Western Europe. But the trenches of the Western Front were by far the most, dare I say, iconic aspects of the war. As I'm sure most of you are aware, trenches in a military context are defensive earthworks that are used to protect troops from the sheer scale of the opposing side's firepower. So what this essentially means is that the weapons technology used in what is often described as the first modern or first industrial war, it was apologies. The sort of weapons technology was primarily responsible for the shape or the format that the war would take. So trench systems, they were constructed along a front that was roughly 750 kilometers long. So running more or less unbroken from the English Channel all the way down to the Swiss border. Now, when we speak about it, we usually will use terminology like talking about the front line or the firing line. But that's not to say that it was one continuous unbroken trench. Um, when I say it was sort of ran continuously from the English Channel to the Swiss border, it actually was a lot more complicated than just one thin line that ran 750 kilometers long. So this here, the photo on the right, um, is an aerial photograph of opposing trench systems in the Loos sector that was taken sometime during the July of 1917. So this here, if you can see my little blue cursor, this gap here, you can see would be a frontline trench here, and this would be a frontline trench here, and this space in the middle is no man's land. So hopefully that'll help you orient yourselves a little bit. And sort of my objective here is to illustrate the extent to which these systems and how complex they were existed. Because that's sort of really the operative word here is systems. How we speak and think about complex systems or networks, such as the trenches on the Western Front, really starts to beg the question, what do we mean when we say the front line? I think for a lot of us, when we picture the First World War, again, we sort of picture something that looks a lot like the photo on the right. We think of the infantry in the frontline trenches. But the question is further complicated when we actually start to consider the variety of different weapons and technological devices that were used during the conduct of war on the Western Front. So this is a somewhat simplified diagram, but it should sort of give you a better sense, a little clearer sense at least, of how an average British trench system was set up. So it's a little bit like an onion. It's got layers. In addition to the frontline trench, which you can see up here, is also called the firing trench or the fire trench, or the firing line. It's essentially all the same thing. It's the sort of furthest forward line of trenches. But past that, you can see this network of support and communication and reserve trenches that reinforced it. So you can see all this is the second line, and then all these zigzagging communication trenches that would run up to the frontmost trenches. But it doesn't stop there. Beyond the trenches themselves, there are supply dumps, there are dugouts, there are aid posts, there are advanced first aid posts, billets, unit headquarters, there are even cemeteries further to the rear, as you can see down in the bottom right-hand corner there. So really you can see from this diagram that while the firing line, while the frontline trenches is the furthest forward, it is just one part of a much larger whole or a much larger system. And now I'd like to focus on a specific piece of technology. At this point, you can probably guess what it is, but that is artillery. So the First World War has frequently been described as an artillery war. So historian John Terrain describes it as, quote, artillery was the battle winner. Artillery was what caused the greatest loss of life, the most dreadful wounds, and the deepest fear, end quote. So artillery caused the majority of casualties on the Western Front. German, French, and British sources, their estimates vary a little bit, but they all roughly place them between 55 and 60% of all casualties for the entire war on the Western Front. So beyond the human cost, and the human cost was immense, it also had the capacity to shape the very format of the war itself. As I said on a previous slide, the weapons used is what necessitated the use of trenches in the first place. So ultimately, it dictated the shape of war on the Western Front. The capacity to fire high explosive and shrapnel shells over long distances, the high volume of shell fire it was instrumental in dictating the format of the war by driving troops to entrench themselves on the Western Front in order to just keep themselves alive. And for that reason, artillery power, and in particular, its like tactical integration with infantry units and other branches of service, it became an increasingly decisive factor in the outcomes of battles on the Western Front. So the Canadian Corps, which we're here to talk about today, it was no exception. But the development of this branch of service and its eventual efficacy in combat began long before the first Canadian gunners arrived in France in early 1915. So broadly speaking, the there are sort of two categories of artillery in this time period, and they're sort of more distinguished by gun sizes. So field guns and field artillery, they were smaller, they were more mobile, and they were stationed further, like closer to frontline trenches, but they could still hit targets about 5 to 6 kilometers away. So of the field artillery, the 18-pounder during the First World War was sort of the workhorse, but it wasn't always so. So we will talk lots about that in sort of the coming minutes. But there were also 4.5-inch howitzers were also commonly used as well. And again, we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. In terms of heavier artillery, there was also the siege artillery or garrison artillery. Heavier siege guns, they were located further to the rear, they were less mobile, and their positions were more fortified. I believe all of these are siege guns or heavy artillery, all of the photographs that I have here for you on this slide. Despite my selection of photographs, my research focuses predominantly on the field artillery. So the remainder of this presentation, I'm mostly going to be focusing on the field artillery, but I will make reference to the siege artillery occasionally. So without further ado, let's talk a bit about Canadian artillery in the late 19th century. So the most comprehensive source that we have on Canadian artillery and its history is a 2-volume work by Colonel G.W.L. Nicholson called The Gunners of Canada. And essentially, his 2 volumes cover the development of artillery in Canada from 1534 until its publication in the 1960s. So that's a big history to cover, and I am definitely not going to have time to go over the entire 500-year history of artillery, what we now call Canada. But I'm going to jump right in around 1890 and kind of give you a sense of what the situation was, specifically for the militia artillery in the 1890s. So as per Nicholson's accounts, there had been significant instability in the amount of militia spending in the late 19th century, which affected the capacity for all Canadian militia units, including artillery batteries, to recruit and train members of the active militia. Writing in the early 1890s, then Lieutenant, but who would later go on to command the Canadian artillery during the First World War. So then Lieutenant E.W.B. Morrison, he wrote of the state of the Canadian artillery, quote, "There are no ammunition wagons or forges, and no harness to draw them if there was. The guns would only shoot up to 3,500 yards, and there was no adequate manufacturing facilities in the Dominion to supply them with enough ammunition in case of war," end quote. So Morrison paints quite a dire picture of the situation for the militia artillery and even the permanent force in the late 1890s, or in the 1890s, sorry. Events that occurred in the 1890s did sort of serve as a little bit of a wake-up call, however. So there was a boundary dispute between Venezuela and British Guyana, which actually threatened Anglo-American war. And it provided something of a reality check for Ottawa, and it helped to spur on a dramatic increase in militia spending just before the turn of the 20th century. So the good news for artillery is that this meant that new equipment was on the way, and there were more opportunities to use it, both domestically and abroad. So prior to this point, militia batteries had been using the old 9-pounder rifled muzzle loading guns. So for those of you who are at all familiar with artillery, it meant that essentially the guns themselves had to be loaded through the muzzle. In my time at Fort York, we did artillery demonstrations, and I can tell you that it is quite a hassle to load those guns, even in when you're just doing demonstrations, let alone in a combat context. So these older guns were replaced with a much more modern 12-pounder breech-loading field gun. So that completely eliminated the need for the hassle of muzzle loading, so huge upgrade. And the newer shells also used smokeless cordite gunpowder, which eliminated the need for black powder charges. So again, much easier to use and to maintain. So the Dominion Artillery Association had initially been formed in 1876, but it really didn't come into its own until there were these changes in militia funding in the 1890s. Worked closely with the Department of Militia and Defense to establish standardized rules, and dole out sort of various prizes for various competitions that batteries could participate in during annual inspections and summer training camps, to kind of incentivize artillery training. The Dominion Artillery Association could also send Canadian detachments to participate in similar competitions abroad, specifically in Britain, against British units, such as the best known one would have been at Shoeburyness, I believe the National Artillery Association in Britain. So here on the right, we have an engraving from 1886 depicting a Canadian gun team competing in Britain at Shoeburyness against British gun crews. So it's a bit of a comical illustration, but hopefully they can kind of give you an idea of the types of competitions and the various different aspects of competitions that were kind of common at this time. Now, this is all well and good, but arguably the most important aspect of these overseas competitions was the opportunity for Canadian gunners to mix and to intermingle and to sort of share knowledge, specifically knowledge about gunnery, with their British counterparts, and then to return to Canada and disseminate that invaluable knowledge amongst their respective militia batteries upon returning home. Now, then we come to the turn of the 20th century and the Boer War, or the South African War. So the South African War was fought between 1899 and 1902, between Britain and the two Afrikaner republics of Transvaal and the Orange Free State in South Africa, as the name suggests. Now, why this is so significant for Canada, and specifically for Canadian artillery, is that it was the first time that Canadian troops served overseas in conflict. So over the course of that 3 years, Canada sent 3 contingents to South Africa, totaling about 7,000 Canadians overall. Now, the second Canadian contingent is of the most interest to us because that included a brigade that made up of 3 batteries of field artillery. So these batteries were designated C, D, and E, which is sort of a callback to the 2 batteries of the 2 permanent force batteries in Canada at the time were A battery and B battery, and the rest of the Canadian artillery at that time was made up of militia batteries. So these batteries were designated C, D, and E, and they were each equipped with 6 12-pounder guns. As I discussed before, the 12-pounders were relatively new to the Canadian artillery at this time. So if you look here in the top right, you can see my little cursor. This is an example of the kind of 12-pounder gun that was used by the Canadians in South Africa. And then here in the bottom right, this is a photograph of a subsection of E battery with 2 of their 12-pounders. Now, again, I don't have time to go into all the details about the Boer War, but I do want to give you an idea of some of the key lessons that the Canadian artillery took from their participation in the conflict. Because the conflict itself was a bit of a mixed bag, but it did come with some very valuable lessons that could be carried forward into future conflicts. So, firstly, there was a significant need for heavier artillery. So the 12-pounders that the Canadians had taken with them to South Africa, despite the fact that they were sort of, top of the line new equipment for the Canadian artillery, they were too light and they had too short a range to really be effective against the Boers. So by comparison, the British batteries that had been deployed to South Africa, they were armed with 15-pounders, which were much more effective, both in terms of like range and firepower, which was really frustrating for the Canadian artillery because they had been almost completely rearmed in the 1890s. They had, spent a significant amount of money rearming the Canadian artillery with these new 12-pounders. But instead of ordering heavier armaments, they had gone with the 12-pounders, which then proved to be almost obsolete right off the bat in a larger scale conflict. Secondly, there was the need for greater concealment in action and greater usage of indirect fire. So direct fire being, you point at a target and you essentially shoot at it. By this point, artillery fire was becoming more and more indirect. I don't have a ton of time to get into sort of the advent of scientific gunnery during the First World War, but essentially indirect fire became the order of the day for artillery over the next decade, 2 decades or so. Prior to South Africa, it was standard practice for guns to position themselves on higher ground and to fire at their enemies from there from a position at like a very sort of high vantage point. So this practice, along with the lack of adoption of gun shields to protect gunners from shrapnel and from rifle fire, um, positioning guns that looked like this along a ridge line to fire down on your enemies was tantamount to suicide. Um, and the capacity to fortify positions and sort of maintain cover would become imperative during the next conflict. Thirdly, there was a significant need for greater systematization and centralization of command and control and organization in general in the artillery. So despite mobilizing as a complete brigade, the 3 batteries of the second contingent didn't actually campaign together much at all during the conflict, largely because of the guerrilla tactics used by the Boer. So rather than having major confrontations, it was much more guerrilla warfare than the Canadian artillery was prepared to contend with. But splitting up also occurred on the battery level during the conflict as well. So C, D, and E batteries, they had each mobilized with a complement of 6 12-pounder guns, but at any given time, half a battery might be made up of gun crews from elsewhere in the Empire when it came into action. Major Hunter Ogilvie of E Battery recalled that at one point, quote, "For 6 weeks I commanded a battery, the right section of which consisted of 2 guns of the Royal Field Artillery," so British, the center section of 2 guns of the Royal Canadian Artillery, and the left section, 2 guns of the Royal Australian Artillery, end quote. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, range and firepower was an issue for the Canadian artillery in South Africa. Their experiences during the South African War significantly demonstrated the need for larger firing ranges, like training ranges, to adequately train artillery personnel. So they calculated that for the field artillery, again, not the heavy artillery, which had the longer firing ranges, but for the field artillery, the minimum necessary distance for firing ranges for training purposes was about 2 miles or a little over 3 kilometers. So what do we do with that information? At the 1905 annual general meeting of the Artillery Association, the Dominion Artillery Association, the then Minister of Militia promised that suitable grounds for artillery training, the annual artillery training camps, they would be selected that year, and it would include adequate space to construct artillery ranges to actually properly train Canadian artillery militia. So in the years leading up to 1905, a number of different firing exercises had been attempted at Camp Niagara and Camp Deseronto with varying levels of success. One lieutenant colonel did describe the attempts at firing exercises at Camp Niagara, I believe in 1904, as being, quote, "a sight to make angels weep." So that should give you an idea of how well some of these firing exercises actually went. But why Petawawa? So Petawawa was, in many ways, the ideal location for an artillery camp. Firstly, it was very large. Before acquisition by the federal government, much of the area had been home to German settlers. So about 18,000 acres or over 100 properties were bought from these settlers by the federal government, with another 55,000 acres of crown land acquired from the government of Ontario. So it was a very large swath of land that was eventually converted into a military camp. It also had incredibly varied terrain. So it had rolling hills, there were like large forested areas. It was partially sandy. It had various lakes and rivers intersecting each other. And finally, it was relatively central. So in just its first year of operations, batteries from as far away as Winnipeg and Woodstock, New Brunswick were actually able to make the trip and participate in sort of the annual training camps that the militia artillery hosted annually. So the first annual camp at Petawawa was definitely a bit of a mixed bag. It was the first time any of the participating batteries had actually had the chance to practice under conditions that even came close to replicating those that they would encounter in a combat setting. So the fire effect produced during this time by these gun crews was described as being generally poor. But however, it was still a valuable experience. Participants received hands-on practice more so than they would have received in previous years at previous camps. And the various documented shortcomings could also be used to improve future training and annual camps going forward. So 2 years later, in 1907, all branches, not just artillery, but all branches of the permanent force were actually able to assemble at Petawawa for the first time. So not the militia, the permanent force, for the first time, and actually carry out combined arms training, which came much closer to replicating conditions that troops would face in the coming war. Gunners of the permanent force were actually also able to remain in Petawawa after the end of the annual camp to instruct militia artillery batteries at their annual training camp. So you had members of the professional, like what is essentially, the professional military at this time, instructing the militia and sort of imparting their knowledge and technical expertise to the militia. So just generally a much better training experience than they would have received otherwise. So all of the photographs on this slide were taken at Petawawa Camp between 1905 and 1912. So the top and bottom left, so here and here, can give you more of an idea of the general landscape and what the camp looked like when it was set up. The center photograph here on the left, and then these two photographs on the right, depict some of the maneuvers undertaken by different artillery units at Petawawa during the first decade in existence, including firing exercises, which again were so important. Now, while the establishment of Camp Petawawa was a watershed moment for the artillery training in Canada, I would also be remiss if I didn't mention some other important training grounds. So travel to centralized training grounds at Petawawa was not always feasible, especially for batteries in Western Canada and in the Maritimes. So in Alberta, some batteries trained at would become known as Sarcee Camp, which was established on Tsuut'ina Nation reserve lands just outside Calgary. And in Manitoba, batteries assembled at Camp Sewell, which is just outside Brandon. So this site would later become known as Camp Hughes during the First World War and is roughly 25 kilometers away from the modern site of CFB Shiloh, which is the home station of the Royal Canadian Artillery to this day. So both photographs here are from Sewell Camp, including the sort of train station. So despite the improved training grounds at Petawawa and elsewhere, again, which enabled annual artillery camps to engage in live firing exercises, there were no combined arms training camps between 1907 and 1912. As I mentioned, combined arms training camps were really important because the close cooperation, specifically between infantry and artillery, would become imperative in the coming First World War, in order to actually be successful in combat. So combined arms training camps were incredibly important, and again, a period of militia spending cutbacks made it so that this was not possible to host these between 1907 and 1912, which meant that Canadian artillery received very little training on close infantry support, which would become integral during the First World War. So as I said, this was a period of financial strain for the militia department, which meant that between 1907 and 1912, the artillery, both the permanent force artillery and the militia artillery, would be the only branches of service to actually make use of the training facilities at Petawawa. So for the 1909 to 1910 fiscal year, the budgetary strain on the militia department actually meant that many militia batteries weren't even fully able to get up to strength for their annual camps, and attended camp either at half strength or less. The same year, there were some changes in terms of on the technological side of things. So as you recall, I had discussed the 12-pounder, which was introduced to the Canadian artillery batteries in the 1890s. 1909, 1910, so shortly after the introduction of the 12-pounder, the new 18-pounder quick-firing field gun was introduced in the Canadian artillery. So all the images on this slide are from the 1913 handbook for the quick-firing 18-pounder. So you will notice the more robust construction compared to the 12-pounder. You can notice here the built-in recoil mechanism and the gun shield, all of which the 12-pounder lacked. So it was a significant improvement. So despite the issues in hosting camps and getting batteries up to strength to attend camps, 8 field batteries were able to be equipped with the new 18-pounder. So again, this is kind of a mixed bag period for the Canadian artillery. The new 18-pounder was vastly superior to the 12-pounder in terms of the technological advancements, but also in terms of the drill. So the gun drill was simpler, it was faster, it was easier to get the hang of, and the handling of the gun was a lot easier as well. So huge technological upgrade, even with financial constraints. The problem was acquiring large numbers of the 18-pounder was a lot easier said than done. Even after Sam Hughes, probably a familiar name to many of you, took over as the Minister of Militia and Defense in 1911, and after which point there was a significant increase in militia spending, it was still challenging to acquire the necessary armaments to properly arm militia and the militia artillery in Canada. So when Sam Hughes took over in 1911, he placed an order for roughly 300 of these field guns from armament firms in Britain, including the Vickers Company and the Coventry Ordnance Works. Now, these orders went unfulfilled for reasons that are not actually clear. I did my best to figure out exactly what had been going on there, but even Major General Edward Morrison, who you might recall earlier, E.W.B. Morrison, he never received a satisfactory explanation for why these orders went unfulfilled. Sam Hughes would go on to demand the order be increased to 500 field guns and howitzers, again from the same firms. He would send Major General Edward Morrison to England specifically to demand the delivery of at least some of these armaments. Only 20 of them were ever received from Vickers Company until long after the war began. And even then, they were only the gun tubes themselves that were received. So the gun tube itself is quite literally this component of the gun. It lacked limbers, it lacked the adequate recoil mechanisms. It was essentially unusable. So after receiving these 20 gun tubes, they would actually need to be mounted on limbers and have their carriages constructed by the Ottawa Car Company in Ottawa, actually, after arriving in Canada. Now, despite all these challenges, to be completely fair, the shortages in armaments was not exclusively a Canadian problem. Upon the outbreak of war, the British Army was also incredibly short of field guns and howitzers. And it was actually so short of armaments that Canada had to send what few surplus guns it was able to acquire by 1914, along with the first contingent in 1914. Okay. So now we have arrived at the outbreak of the First World War. Now, when Britain declared war on Germany on August 4th, 1914, Canada, as a British Dominion, was automatically at war as well. So for the next component of my presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the training of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Canadian divisions and their divisional artillery, since that gives us the most complete picture of what artillery training looked like in Canada during the war. The artillery of the 4th Division was largely composed of batteries from the first 3 due to artillery reorganization that occurred in 1917, so I'm going to be focusing on that less. Now, the 1st contingent, which would later become known as the 1st Canadian Division, included both field and heavy artillery, as well as a divisional ammunition column to supply them. So the 3 field artillery brigades that would accompany the 1st Canadian contingent, they consisted of 3 6-gun batteries that were armed with 18-pounders and a brigade ammunition column, in addition to the divisional ammunition column. The contingent, it also sailed with a heavy battery that was armed with 60-pounders, which had its own ammunition column. But again, I'm going to be focusing mostly on the field artillery. Now, normally a divisional formation, such as the 1st Canadian contingent, would have included a howitzer brigade. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the distinction between a gun and a howitzer, guns, which is generally, or field guns in this case, they had longer barrels and they fired shells on a very sort of flat parabolic trajectory. Whereas howitzers had shorter barrels and they fired at a much steeper angle, usually about 45 degrees. So both guns and howitzers were made for they made multiple different sizes of each, and they were used by both field and siege artillery. But Canada did not have sufficient howitzers to send overseas with its first contingent. In 1911, Ottawa had ordered a complement of 27 4.5-inch howitzers and all the sort of necessary accompanying equipment from a manufacturer in Britain. But as with their sort of field gun ordering debacle, 3 years later, in 1914, only 7 of 27 ordered howitzers had actually been received. There were 2 militia batteries in Guelph, the 11th and the 16th batteries, that were armed with 5-inch howitzers, but at the outbreak of war, these were very old and they were absolutely not fit for service overseas. So all that to say, there was no howitzer batteries accompanying the 1st Canadian contingent. Now, there was also the problem of battery structure and mobilization upon the outbreak of war. So some militia batteries were mobilized as complete units, and others were broken up to sort of fill out the batteries that had been called on to mobilize. So this led to considerable disappointment amongst batteries that were not called on to mobilize as complete units. Understandably so, at the outbreak of war, you want to mobilize as the unit that you've been training with every year. And it's only the case for some of the militia batteries in Canada. For batteries that were not called on to mobilize as units, for the most part, this meant turning over the guns that they had in their possession and then becoming inactive during the war, even while new batteries were recruited from their communities for overseas service. All right. So what did training look like for the 1st contingent? So the 1st Canadian contingent, or division, mobilized and underwent its initial training at Valcartier, which is a camp that was established just northwest of Quebec City. So this land had been acquired back in 1912 by the federal government for the purposes of establishing a military camp, but in 1914 that had not happened yet. So what you see before you are images from Valcartier. Top image here is a general view of camp that was published in the Montreal Daily Star in early September 1914, and the bottom photograph is of the 1st Canadian Infantry Battalion. So hopefully this can give you a sense of the sheer scale of the camp. This did not exist at the outbreak of war. In 1914, this site was transformed into a complete military camp in less than a month. So it is a remarkable feat of logistics. Now, the role of existing militia battalions was essentially to organize and dispatch all their men to Valcartier, and upon arrival to Valcartier, they would be sorted to form new battalions that would go on to make up the 1st contingent. So like I said, it was getting Valcartier up and running in the space of a few weeks was an impressive logistical feat. It was also in many ways incredibly disorganized. Men who were arriving at camp had to be completely clothed and equipped. There were some uniform shortages that organizers had to contend with. It was a lot easier said than done to get everybody, falling in uniform. In fact, only 5 battalions actually had webbing equipment with them when they sailed for Britain. So webbing is essentially sort of the kind of like belt vest that was a very important part of the First World War soldiers' kit. So only a few battalions actually had them when they sailed overseas, just to give you a sense of how disorganized they got. Now, the situation was slightly different for the artillery. So for individual batteries, for those who had been called upon to mobilize as complete units, much of the initial mobilization occurred at their respective local headquarters, many of which were in Eastern Canada for the 1st contingent. Now, during this time, artillery personnel were uniformed, they were properly equipped, and batteries were furnished with necessary horses. So even though they ended up arriving at Valcartier almost a full week after all other service branches, by the time they arrived, they were still a bit ahead of the curve, as they at least arrived with their equipment, their horses, and the necessary components of their kit. So, training at Valcartier, and I am using the word training quite loosely, only lasted about a month, and it was riddled with interruptions. So reorganizing and integrating new batteries, administrative processes such as attestation, medical exams, and inoculations, the arrival of additional equipment, all this ate into any real time for training. However, that did not mean they couldn't get any training in. So for gunners at Valcartier, the days would begin with reveille and were filled with duties that involved the care and training of horses, their gun drill, signaling training, and driving maneuvers. Um, Now, for the infantry, at least Valcartier did include rifle ranges for that sort of initial rifle training. Um, Arguably, the most significant hindrance for gunners was the absolute lack of artillery ranges at Valcartier. So the only real firing practice that could take place involved firing live rounds at white sheets that had been set up on the far bank of the St. Lawrence River. So they were able to get some firing training in, but it was not ideal, and it was largely ad hoc. So when the first contingent departed Valcartier at the end of September, the artillery took with them their full complement of roughly 70 guns of varying sizes, 1,500 rounds of ammunition per gun, and just under 200 ammunition wagons, plus additional equipment that was being made available to Britain, who was also dealing with the shortages in armaments. Now, when the guns were loaded onto the ships, the wheels were not actually removed from the axles, which means that they were essentially just like lined up wheel to wheel in the ship's holds, meaning they took up an unnecessary amount of space to the point where an additional vessel actually had to be chartered to transport horses and other equipment overseas. So all in all, mobilization at Valcartier was a bit of a mess, but it did get done. So just quickly here, along the bottom of this slide is a photograph of the 2nd Battery, 1st Brigade of the Canadian Field Artillery at Valcartier in 1914. And the top 2 photographs involve artillery recruits training with their guns, again, at Valcartier in 1914. So after the first contingent sailed, recruiting for the second contingent, 2nd Canadian Contingent, again, which would become known as the 2nd Canadian Division, began almost immediately after the first contingent sailed. Now, for the artillery, this came with a whole new set of challenges that were very different from the ones that they had faced at Valcartier. Firstly, there was a lack of equipment in the country. As I mentioned, almost all of Canada's 18-pounders had gone overseas with the first contingent, either with the Canadian artillery or to be made available to the British artillery, the Royal Artillery. There were a total of 38 18-pounders that remained in Canada, but of that 38, 32 of them did not have carriages or limbers. So again, we were back with the same problem with the gun tubes. It was just the tubes and nothing else. They were unusable. And secondly, there were no existing facilities for concentrating and training a large force over winter. So the artillery of the 2nd contingent actually ended up doing most of their training at local depots or in much smaller concentrations, such as in Toronto. So the field artillery of the 2nd contingent was to be made up of the 4th, 5th, and 6th brigades, with field batteries numbering 13th through 24th divided across those 3 brigades. Now, with the exception of the 16th Battery, which I'll discuss in a second, most of the 4th Brigade CFA trained in Toronto over the winter using the old 12-pounder guns that I talked about earlier. So again, this meant that they did not have the built-in hydraulic recoil mechanisms, meaning they had to be manually reset whenever firing maneuvers were done. Historian Bill Rawling described them as being, quote, more useful for practicing mounted maneuvers than for shooting. But that's not to say that they didn't get any shooting practice in. So similar to what the first contingent had done at Valcartier, the 4th Brigade actually shot at targets that had been towed out into Lake Ontario. So the photographs on these slides were taken by John Boyd Sr., and they document firing exercises that were undertaken by the 14th Battery in Toronto in February 1915. So essentially what they did is they tugged out 2 large targets that were made of a wooden square frame with large squares of white canvas mounted to them. And they were tugged out, I believe, a couple kilometers into Lake Ontario, and then ultimately fired at. So it was quite a treacherous enterprise, as the small tugboat that was actually tasked with dragging the targets out into Lake Ontario struggled to both maneuver the targets and to maneuver around all the ice, again, because it's February in Toronto, and if you know Toronto in February, it can get a bit icy. Now, on February 22nd, 1915, under the headline, Lake Waters Resound with Artillery Fire, The Globe, a Toronto newspaper, wrote about the shoot, quote, "Never since the War of 1812 had a single cannon shot or shell been discharged from Lake Ontario's shore until Saturday. 12-pounder guns were employed. The type of shell used was shrapnel, and the artillerymen showed the keenest interest in their first practice with live ammunition," end quote. So at the end of that day, one of the targets had just two small shrapnel holes in it, but the other target was quite badly damaged on the top section, and the crossbar had been completely smashed. So not bad for their first time live firing at all. As for other batteries, the 16th battery, which I mentioned previously, it was the only battery of the 4th Brigade not to train in Toronto over the winter. It actually began its training right here in London, Ontario, and was relocated to Guelph that January. Now, what was special about the 16th battery is they were fortunate enough to have their full complement of 18-pounder guns much earlier than the other batteries did, meaning they were actually able to train at length with the artillery pieces they would ultimately be using in France. By comparison, the batteries in Toronto would not actually receive their 18-pounders until March 1915. So most of the second contingent sailed for England in the spring of 1915, but the scarcity of equipment for training, the lack of adequate accommodations while training, it meant that the 4th Brigade of the Canadian Field Artillery was actually the only one of the three that was in a position to be ready to accompany the rest of the contingent. Out west, the 5th Brigade, Canadian Field Artillery, it was actually the first overseas artillery brigade raised from Western Canada. They trained at Winnipeg over the winter, but they would relocate from Winnipeg in June 1915 to Camp Hughes, formerly Sewell Camp, which I mentioned earlier. They would remain there until August, at which point they would sail for England. They did have two 18-pounders to train with, but they also had a full complement of 12-pounders, which were used for practicing mounted maneuvers. Now, the 6th Brigade CFA was meant to be the 3rd Field Artillery Brigade that was attached to the 2nd contingent. It never came to be for various reasons, but it was replaced by the 7th Brigade CFA, which spent the summer of 1915 training at Valcartier, as their predecessors had the previous year. So the 5th and 7th Brigades, they would not sail until August 1915, at which point they would join the rest of the 2nd contingent training in England. And now we return to Petawawa. So G.W.L. Nicholson, who, as I said, is sort of the keystone or capstone source, I guess, for Canadian artillery history. He has very little to say about training programs in Canada after 1915. But fortunately, for us as historians, many artillerymen left detailed records of their time in training, both in Canada and in England. And we can kind of piece together what training was like in Canada after 1915. For instance, the 55th Battery, Canadian Field Artillery's regimental history, they write about their training in the summer of 1916, stating that, quote, "At the end of May, all the batteries then in formation, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, gathered together under canvas at Petawawa. It was the biggest artillery camp that Canada had ever seen, and Petawawa was in many ways an ideal location for it," end quote. When Robert Gordon Brown, an artilleryman, arrived at Petawawa that summer, he described it to his mother as follows, quote, "It seems an ideal spot for a military camp. There are fine paved roads running all through it, and places for each battery marked out at different places here and there. It is very sandy here, but it is mostly covered with grass, bushes, and stunted evergreens. A few steps from here, I can look down at the Ottawa River below. There are many little islands in it and big rafts of logs along the other shore. It is very pretty indeed," end quote. In fact, the bottom image here, again, look for my little blue cursor, is a photograph of artillerymen actually swimming with their horses out in the Ottawa River at Petawawa that summer. Robert Gordon Brown also wrote favorably about the sandy terrain and its propensity to dry out quickly whenever it did rain, which actually spared those at Petawawa from the muddy conditions that often plagued other camps. Now, not all artillerymen wrote as fondly about Petawawa as Brown did. Another gunner, Archie Wills, frequently lamented the presence of mosquitoes there and recalled them being, quote, "bent on a blood pilgrimage," and actually recalled one instance where one of his tent mates was trying to hunt them down with the mallet used to knock tent pegs into the ground. So essentially a rubber mallet, fighting mosquitoes with a hammer, which it does make for quite an evocative image. Other complaints about Petawawa targeted the food, both in terms of quality and of scarcity, with other camps that were more centrally located. It was possible to, go into town and get food, but with Petawawa, it was much more challenging because it was more remote. So of this issue, Archie Wills also recalled in his later memoirs that, quote, one orderly officer, when faced with a series of complaints, lectured us on the theory of autosuggestion. He told us to imagine the food was good. It's too bad army regulations do not permit the early extermination of that kind of fool. Now, days training at Petawawa were filled with instructional lectures, mounted and dismounted drill, inspections, and firing exercises, with firing exercises following extensive work on section gun drill. So again, Petawawa's size and location made firing exercises much more feasible than at previous camps, including training in Toronto and at Valcartier the previous, or 2 years prior. Now, the 60th Battery's regimental history records live firing exercises being carried out still using the 12-pounders, and that there were some modern 18-pounders that were available at Petawawa. There were very few, and they were largely used more for instructional purposes rather than actual firing. So in some cases, batteries would rotate in and out of live shooting exercises. Robert Gordon Brown wrote in July 1916 that batteries in camp were firing around 15 shots per day on firing exercises. But other firing exercises actually took the form of competitive shoots that kind of replicated earlier artillery competitions seen both in Canada and in Britain prior to the war as part of annual militia training. So the general structure of such shoots was recorded as usually involving participating batteries being told to start from a specific map location, come into action against a hypothetical hostile battery in another location, fire 15 rounds, and then return to their starting position. This also required reconnaissance, the establishment of observation posts, and the laying of telephone wire in order to communicate between positions, all of which were meant to replicate or at least attempt to replicate combat conditions on the Western Front. So umpires, they were designated to allocate points for these competitions based on the effective rounds fired, so the rounds that were fired that actually hit their targets, as well as the time that it took to complete all the tasks. So the maximum time that was given to complete these tasks was initially around 30 minutes, but later competitions were reduced down to 15 minutes to really sort of test the batteries in training. Now, in their regimental history, the 60th Battery Canadian Field Artillery boasts that they were the best performing battery, even when working with just that 15-minute window of time. I was unable to corroborate that, so I guess we just have to sort of take them at their word there. So training at Petawawa in 1916 was much more successful than it had been for previous contingents. However, for reasons that I will elaborate on in a second, a lot of the gunners would have to be retrained once they arrived in Great Britain. And early that September, the batteries that had spent the summer at Petawawa broke camp, made the long trip to Halifax, and then embarked for England to begin the next phase of their training or retraining at Whitley Camp. So we know, again, though there isn't sort of a robust narrative of what the training looked like at Petawawa and elsewhere in 1917 and 1918, we know that similar artillery camps were held in 1917 and 18 at Petawawa. So this here is a clipping from the Globe, again, the Toronto newspaper that I mentioned previously, in May 1917, describing the plan for all artillery units in the country to concentrate at Petawawa for training that summer. While artillery training had progressed dramatically from the first few shells that were fired over the St. Lawrence at Valcartier in 1914, there were some training limitations associated with training in Canada, even in the later stages of the war, that were never entirely overcome. So I mentioned having to retrain units once they arrived in Britain. Now, the reason for this was probably the greatest hindrance of artillery training in Canada during the First World War, and that is that there was no standardization of training for all branches. Now, this was an ongoing issue across the service, and the artillery was no exception to it. Practical lessons that were learned on the Western Front over the course of the war, they were not being adequately digested and communicated to instructors in Canada. So essentially, lessons that were being learned from actual combat conditions on the Western Front were not being they were not translating into training curricula in Canada. And there was no centralized artillery training school in Canada until the 1920s. So despite improvements in training, there was still an ad hoc nature to it that prevented it from being really sort of consistent and standard across all units. Now the situation was somewhat better in England. The photograph here on the right is a photograph of Canadian gunners taken at Whitley Camp. They're conducting firing exercises while wearing small box respirators. You can kind of tell that they're wearing essentially gas masks. Now, being able to maintain a consistent rate of fire, even while wearing a small box respirator, was an invaluable skill on the Western Front, particularly during the latter half of the war, when gun crews became frequent and favorite targets of enemy gas attacks. So you can see some of the sort of lessons that are being learned on the Western Front being distilled into training programs in England in a way that they were not in Canada. However, even in England, there was still a lack of consistency that plagued training camps such as Shorncliffe, Whitley, and Bramshot, all of which acted independently of each other. So there was no consistency across camps. So depending on what camp you ended up in to train, your training program could be somewhat different. So for these reasons, and because of the dynamic nature of war on the Western Front, where lessons were constantly being learned, training was an ongoing process that continued long after the batteries even arrived in France. Leading into 1918, for instance, batteries rotated their sections in and out of the Canadian Corps Artillery School, which was established in France, where gunners underwent additional training, particularly in open or maneuver warfare that would become crucial when the war on the Western Front became more mobile once more in August 1918. So what can we take away from all this? Perhaps what is most visible when we examine the evolution of artillery training on Canadian soil and artillery training in general during this period is the ongoing pursuit to better understand, adapt, and integrate newer technology into military doctrine and to apply lessons of previous conflicts to future ones. And this is a process that never really ends and would continue well after the guns fell silent. And thank you. That's all I have for you this evening.
Thank you so much, Hazel. That was just amazing. And what a wealth of knowledge and research you've been able to provide for us. I'm going to keep my eye on the chat. If anyone has any questions or comments, please add them into the chat and I will read them out. While that kind of opens up, I actually had a couple questions for you, if you don't mind. You mentioned loosely about having used some artillery pieces while working at Fort York, which is where Hazel and I met. So I'm intimately familiar with the artillery piece. I'm wondering, did actually going through that drill and having that physical experience with an artillery piece, has that informed, like that embodied experience, has that informed your outlook on this particular research?
I would certainly say it's sort of what keyed me into it. Um, I think a lot about Fort George muster specifically and being told, open your mouth, it will help with the noise. And you know, the sort of really awful ear feelings that came with not following those instructions and the like. That's just a specific example. But I mean, I think, you know, it's hard to compare a partial charge of a 6-pounder with a 3-pound bore to an actual like field or like a quick firing like 18-pounder firing in combat, or you know the hundreds of guns that would have been firing on the Western Front. But I think it certainly got me thinking about the way that bodies and senses are like intimately tied in with how technology is used on the Western Front, and like drill as well, in the way that you know movements have to be so coordinated. And you know, in my research, I found sort of a lot of like gun drill manuals where it talks about the types of like the coordination of movement that's necessary to operate a 12-pounder or an 18-pounder or one of the larger field or siege guns. Um, it's it was certainly sort of the initial spark, I would say, that kind of has opened up this whole can of worms, let's say,
Hmm.
that is sort of coming to underpin my dissertation. But yeah.
Certainly. We have a question in the chat. Was the artillery horse-drawn for all of World War One?
Um, for the most part, yes. So one of the really interesting things about the artillery is how it was, on the one hand, like one of the most technologically advanced branches of service, in terms of like the weapons they were using and in the sort of innovative tactics that they had to use in order to like apply or make use of their technology in like a combat setting. But at the same time, they were so reliant on horses as being their means of um, transporting guns from one position to another. So within the artillery, there were sort of three kind of like branches, I guess, of like the lowest ranking artillerymen. So there were gunners who were actually involved with, firing the guns. There were signalers who were like they largely operated telephones and sort of were the ones that were involved in communicating just all aspects of the gunners war, from headquarters to other positions along the front. And then there were drivers. And so drivers were responsible for the horse teams that would position guns, move guns between positions, but would also be responsible for hauling ammunition up to the guns. So a lot has been written about sort of what the war looked like for drivers. Um, my great grandfather actually was a driver with the 4th Divisional Ammunition Column on the Western Front. And one of the things that other artillery personnel write about gunners is how their position was actually uniquely dangerous because, if you are a signaler or, if you are a gunner who is not actively firing their gun, if you hear a shell coming, you're going to be able to take cover. But drivers couldn't do that because drivers weren't just responsible for themselves, they were also responsible for their horses. So usually it would be one driver for a team of 2 horses, though I believe it was about 6 horses that were needed to haul a field gun effectively. So while other men would be able to take cover if they were under artillery fire, you'd have drivers who would be responsible for calming their horses and corralling their horses and getting them out of danger. So horses are, I would argue, as important as people in the Gunners' War on the Western Front.
Okay, lots of questions. What was the actual ammunition being fired?
Well, that depends on the actual like the actual gun that's being fired. So the 18 pounders that were sort of the workhorse of the Canadian Field Artillery, they would fire, as the name suggests, 18-pounder shells. There are a couple of different propellants that could be used. So cordite was a big one, and I believe I think it's lyddite is the other one. I'm not intimately familiar with like every aspect of the munitions that were used. But sort of there are various different types of shells that could also be used. So there were high explosive shells, which were designed to just explode and produce like large explosions. There were shrapnel shells, which were designed to basically cause, well, they would distribute shrapnel, which would cause injury. And then gas shells were another sort of major type of shell that was used. So different shells could sort of do different purposes, whether that is sort of strictly designed to clear barbed wire, whether it was specifically like an anti-personnel weapon. It would depend on, what it was being used for, what was sort of required, either by an offensive that was sort of being supported, or whether it was just for, support like smaller trench raids, that kind of thing, or if it was for counter battery fire. I believe I mentioned that gas was sort of, or gas attacks were often targeted towards gunners, especially in the latter half of the war. And this is because it would suppress like artillery fire. So one thing that happened a lot was it was called counter battery fire, or artillery duels was kind of another way it was described. Where basically different artillery batteries on opposite sides would be shooting at each other, trying to suppress each other's fire so as not to interfere with their infantries. So gas was often used in a counter battery capacity because it made it really hard for you to operate your artillery piece when you were being like smothered by tear gas, essentially. So all that to say, there were a lot of different types of shells that were used, and it would depend on, what exactly you were trying to accomplish, as well as the type of gun you were using.
It's interesting. It's for me, it's harkening back to what you were mentioning at the beginning of the talk about systems and how the trenches were so interconnected. The ammunition would have had to have been made in factories back in Canada and then shipped over to Europe to then be used. So it's all just a very complex web.
Hmm.
Um,
Absolutely.
Couple of comments here. It was a superb presentation, very detailed explanation. I was surprised recently to find out about the establishment of so many training schools in France, including an infantry school and machine gun school. Had not realized the lack of transmission of lessons learned, which is so standard in combat arms training now, was so pronounced. And then another question, were there any technical advances brought overseas by the Canadians that were distinctly Canadian, i.e. new technology invented in Canada?
That's a really great question. I actually don't have a good answer to that off the top of my head. Um, I mean, it's certainly something that I'm trying to think of, where would be a good place to go looking for such information. Um, there's some great resources. Like I said, GWL Nicholson's History of the Canadian Artillery. If you're looking at a specifically artillery context, which is my expertise, so that's sort of where I'm speaking from. His history is quite comprehensive in terms of at least for the first two contingents on the training process in Canada, and then sort of the continuation of training in England and into the transition onto the actual Western Front and into actual combat. So that could be a really interesting resource to go to if you're interested in looking more sort of at how Canadians made that transition and what they were able to bring with them. I also highly recommend Bill Rawling wrote a book called Surviving Trench Warfare, which is all about technology in the Canadian Corps, not just artillery, but just in general, which is another sort of really great overview of how Canadians were able to sort of engage in the learning process that took them from Canada to England to France, and kind of really adapt to their their environment and become sort of really adept in specifically combined arms warfare by the end of the war. And so while I can't say, definitively if there is a particular technological invention that they took with them, they contributed that sort of set them apart, they were by the end of the war as a corps uniquely adept at fighting the kind of war that was necessary in order to sort of be successful. You often hear sort of the Canadians in 1918 being described as kind of the shock troops of the British Empire, and that's because they had become so adept. And there are a number of different reasons for that. One sort of is that as a core, they were kind of self-contained, and then they were able to disseminate sort of lessons like within the core once they were like at the front, um which and the fact that they were able to establish like training schools in France and to sort of disseminate all of the knowledge that they were sort of learning in combat, um and really kind of prepare for those final offensives so that where they really kind of made a name for themselves. And I think that's sort of what I would identify as being kind of not uniquely Canadian, but like something that the Canadians were very, very sort of well known for at the time. But as for sort of specific technological innovations, again, I don't know off the top of my head, but there are some great resources out there if you are interested in reading that further.
Not artillery, but my first thought was the PH hood, which normally gets attributed as a British invention because of Newfoundland's Dominion status. Um, yeah, so we're at about time. If there's any final questions, just type them in the chat, and otherwise, I think we're about time for the evening. So again, thank you, Hazel, so much for sharing your research with us. I'm really looking forward to sort of the final end result of all your years of hard work. Lots of thank yous in the chat, lots of appreciation for knowing where to go for further research and interest. And all right. Oh, brilliant talk. Thanks so much. And thank you, Osgood, for facilitating. Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, Hazel has included her email address on the screen. So if there's any follow-up, any more research questions, feel free to copy that down and get in touch. And I think we'll call it a night.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming out tonight.